Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. My name is Alexis Rogers, and I'm the Customer Relationship Lead here at RightCapital. And I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on customized client onboarding. And we're very excited to introduce you to our new onboarding templates and a new way to customize the onboarding experience to really reflect what you might be incorporating in your normal data collection process. So we're going to be reviewing how you can customize the onboarding flow going forward, and also two different new visual formattings that are available when it comes to customizing the client onboarding process, and a couple new different key tabs that you might be incorporating when it comes to client onboarding. We're also going to walk through how you can streamline your onboarding process by leveraging templates and having those be used as the default for when you create new clients, and how you can also customize it a little bit further for your practice. And we're going to also go over how you can tailor the onboarding process to each individual client as well. We're also going to be covering the different resources, as always, that you have with RightCapital. One of those resources being that during this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use that questions drop down and type out any questions you might have there. More than happy to engage and answer any questions that you might be having. And so shifting gears into RightCapital, we might be familiar when we first add a new client. The default for when we add a new client is that we're going to be brought to those initial 6 steps of data entry. But now if we look for a specific client that we have that's still in those 6 steps of data entry, like the Schmidt family, for example, they are still in what we call the onboarding process. So we're going to see for them an onboarding tab, since they are still in the initial steps of data entry. And this is the space that's going to allow for us to tailor the onboarding experience for this particular client. So for the Schmidts right now, what we have is that default, like I talked about, which is the profile card layout. And that's going to include those 6 steps of initial data entry that we're used to. It's going to include family, income, savings, net worth, expenses, and goals. But we now also have the option, even with this layout, to include the vault. So especially if we were exchanging documents or uploading documents there, we can now include that by checking this button right off. Same thing with if we do have risk enabled and we are leveraging risk questionnaires, we can choose to include risk questionnaires. If we are wanting to include risk questionnaires into the onboarding process, we can click on this header right here, and then we can choose which questionnaire we're looking to assign, and then choose if we're going to assign it to the client and the co-client by clicking off this button right here. And we'll hit confirm. So to walk through what this looks like and what we might be familiar with, we're going to open up this client plan. And it's going to bring us to those 6 steps of data entry and the vault and risk. So now we have a couple additional steps, and this is walking through the profile layout. So we're always going to be seeing step number 1, which is of course covering and answering that question of who are we planning for. And of course the goals when it comes to onboarding and entering the current path for the client. This process is really dedicated to having a focus and a path that we can follow to really walk through and ensuring that we're entering the current path for the clients. Starting with that number 1 question of who are we planning for, we're then going to be able to see that step 2 with the profile cards layout that we're used to, and for income, same thing for savings, and we can walk through that data entry process. We can see what's happening with the net worth, expenses, goals, and we can still add new goals and everything like that within each of these sections. Same thing with Vault. We can start to customize the Vault folder and also upload files directly from here. And the same thing with risk. So we can walk through answering those risk questionnaires by clicking into the risk questionnaires card and then walking through this either with the client live or if we have them invited to the system. And once we're ready, we can hit that complete button, and it's going to bring us to the full modules of RightCapital, and it's going to exit us out of the onboarding process. But this is what the profile cards layout looks like. We do have a secondary visual layout that you can select from by going back to the advisor portal. We're going to look for that client. Once again, we're going to search for the client. We're going to click on onboarding, and we're going to change our template type. So from the select template type dropdown, right now we currently have that profile card selection that we just walked through. If we change to blueprint, this is going to be switching the visual formatting, and we're going to walk through what this looks like so that way we know going forward which one we might be selecting for each individual client that might be resonating best with your clients. And we're going to include the vaults, and once again, you can include the risk questionnaires if you do have that enabled. Once we hit save, we can open the client plan once again. And to walk through, we're always going to have that step number 1, which is covering the number 1 question of who are we planning for. We can enter that information within each of these cards, as is the normal onboarding process. But now when we go into step 2 for net worth, we're going to see a little bit of a different look and feel here. So we're going to be seeing the blueprint visual layout here. So this is the same information. This is just a different visual aesthetic to how we're entering the current plan. So we can still be answering those same questions or following that same data collection process. It's just about which one might be resonating more on a visual layout standpoint. So we can still add new accounts from here in the net worth, link those accounts if we've got account aggregation as well, but we can now see a little bit clearer who owns what and a little bit of a different layout for net worth than what we saw with the profile cards layout. Going into step 3, we're going to be looking at the goals. For the goals, we're going to be greeted with our board view. So this is going to be, once again, just a little bit of a different visual layout, but we can also change the goals visual layout a little bit further. So we also have the opportunity to switch this view to our timeline view that we might be familiar with the blueprint visual. This is going to be that visual that we might be more used to of the life map in terms of what's happening with our goals. But you can easily switch between the 2 different layouts depending upon which might be resonating most or which one might be a little bit easier for the data entry process. Clicking on the next button, we can then go on to step 4, which is going to be going to income, savings, and expenses. So from here, once again, you still can add new income and start to enter that current path for the clients, add their savings, their expenses, but it's going to be just a little bit of a different layout in terms of how we are interpreting the data. And we still can click into each of these cards as we can do in the actual blueprint module and make adjustments to any of these existing items. And we can click on the add button to add new income, add new savings, and add new expenses once again. But as we can see here, they have some already a little bit of information entered. We can see what their current salary looks like, their current savings path, and also their current expenditure since they are still working. Next up is going to be covering the vault. This layout's going to be the same regardless of which format we choose. The blueprint versus profile cards format is going to be referring to the main 6 steps of the profile entry. And then once again, we can cover the risk questionnaire directly from here. But this is just the visual layout that we can cover and the 2 different paths that you might be able to select from when it comes to how you want the onboarding workflow to go for the individual client. So those are just examples of what that looks like. If we search for the client once again and go to onboarding, it's very important that we cover that there's 2 different ways that we can incorporate onboarding. So right now, when we have an individual client selected, like we do, that's still in the initial steps of data entry, we can customize the onboarding process for this individual client. We're going to cover in a couple seconds how you can create templates and have that be more of a standardized process for onboarding. That way you can use your standardized particular ordering and your particular selections and your particular formatting of the layout that you would like across your clients. But when we have an individual client selected from the client list, like we do right now, we have onboarding selected here. This allows for us to customize the individual onboarding process. And it's very important with onboarding that you still have that flexibility to customize your onboarding workflow, whether it's the client engaged directly in the system or for your own process when walking through it with the client or for your own preference of how you enter data. When it comes to the onboarding selections, whether it's the blueprint selection or the profile card selection, you do have the ability to reorder the steps. So for example, if we are more comfortable covering income, savings, and expenses first, we can just drag and drop and reorder the flow of what we're going to be seeing in these steps. And maybe we talk about goals third and then net worth, or maybe we want to talk about Volt right after family. So you can drag and drop and reorder. When we hit save and we open the client plan, we're going to see an entirely different look and feel to this onboarding workflow. So we're going to be greeted with step number 2, the vaults, then to income, savings, and expenses, which might be resonating more in line with how you typically do the data entry process. Same thing with goals, and then we can touch on net worth and then risk. And that's customizable regardless of which template base you are using for the onboarding process. And this is completely customizable for both of them. So if we just click this drop down right here, we can do the same thing for the profile card selection. Now that we walk through what the visual format looks like in the onboarding process and how you can customize it on the individual client level, if we click into the templates button in the upper right hand corner and into onboarding, this is where we can go to establish a standardized process for our onboarding workflows for clients. So under templates onboarding, we click on the add template button. We can then start to customize what we want to use for templates, and we can of course create multiple templates when it comes to onboarding. So especially if you might have a couple different layouts that you like depending upon your client base, maybe it's based off of the different way that you do planning with the clients or the generational preferences, anything along those lines, you can certainly create multiple templates to leverage. But when we click on the add template button, we can then click on the pencil icon right here to retitle this. And this is going to be our onboarding workflow number 1. We're going to hit the check mark to save the name change. And then from here, we can decide which template formatting we want to use, whether we prefer the profile cards layout or whether we prefer the blueprint layout for this template. In this case, we're going to select the blueprint template layout because we like this a little bit more than the profile cards for what we're looking to establish for our data entry process. So when we select blueprint, we can then check off what we want to include for each of these. We can also reorder. So maybe in this case, we do like to cover income, savings, and expenses first after we answer that first question of who we're planning for, of course, then net worth, and then goals. Then we'll talk about vault and risk questionnaires. Once again, we can click on the header right here to choose which risk questionnaire we're going to be assigning and if we're including both client and co-client. Once we hit save, now when we go to the clients list and we search for that individual client and we go to the onboarding tab, we now have the option to select an onboarding template. So when we select an onboarding template, we're applying it to this individual client that we have selected right now, and that's going to pre-fill all those selections for us and also reorder them for us as well. But it's important to note that even if we apply a template, you still can customize this template further by dragging and dropping or deselecting or selecting specific ones. So you still have full customizability even after applying a template, but the template can be serving as a way to just streamline your workflow in terms of if you are continuously selecting the same things over and over again. Another thing when it comes to customizing the onboarding process or the different templates that we are using. So if we have something selected or deselected, for example, if we remove income, savings, and expenses and vault and risk questionnaires, this would be deselecting it from our onboarding workflow. So now we only have 3 things included for those steps. So if there's a particular step that we're looking to not cover, such as maybe the vault is not necessary for this particular onboarding workflow, or maybe we're not necessarily ready to enter income, savings, and expenses as we remove them, for example, you can fully customize the different steps and include or exclude a couple of the different onboarding steps as well. So you have full customizability of the narrative of the onboarding workflow. Another thing too, if we do have the client engaged directly in the system, If we invited them under client access, for example, this is where we go to enter their email address for the client and co-client, where we can choose to invite them, and also where we can choose whether or not they can interact with the profile, meaning can they update things like their profile information, such as their savings, expenses, salary, things along those lines, or if we want them to have a view-only experience. If we do invite them, they would be able to access the onboarding process if we have each of these steps selected, of course, and if we've granted them access to the different sections that we have selected here. So this would also translate to the client experience in terms of what we're customizing for this onboarding steps. So if we do have the client engaged directly in the system, they would see whatever you have selected here in terms of that process. But it also might be something you're selecting for your own preference. And if we do have a specific template that we have and that we prefer to use, maybe as the default for our conversations with clients, it's important that you also can really have a little bit more of a streamlined process as you start to create and enter clients into RightCapital. So if we just click into the three dots in the upper right-hand corner, into client settings and into client groups, this is where we can go to start to create custom client groups, of course. But what's very important for this conversation is the group that we have selected for our default for new clients and what we have indicated for our default templates. So if you click on the edit button right here, this is where you can establish your standard for what you want to use for a couple different templates. So especially if you're leveraging any other templates, this is a great way to have it be a specific layout for planning access, for example, but also for onboarding templates. So let's say in this case, we do prefer to use our onboarding workflow number 1. We like that layout and we like what we have established there. We want that to be the default for all new clients that we create going forward. We can select that from this list. Same thing for any of these other templates that we might have curated as well. And as we covered, even if we do have that set as a standard for new clients, and if we have that set as a default, you still can go into the individual client level and in their onboarding tab, if they're still in those initial data entry steps, and make adjustments after the client has been created. So this is just a way to really streamline your process. Same thing for if you have and are leveraging the leads program in RightCapital or the leads URL. If you have that activated, same thing for the default for new leads. If we click on the edit button right here, this might be an opportunity for when you probably might be using a different type of template or when you have a secondary template. But if you wanted to, you can also establish different default templates for new clients that are prospects. So you still have full control and you can delineate the difference between your new clients and your new prospects or leads. And that's done in the three dots: client settings, client groups, selection. So for example, if we go back to the clients list and we click on add a new client and we add another client, such as Jack Sparrow, if we are looking to invite the client straight off the bat, we can enter an email address here and choose to invite client to input information now. And this would essentially be having them invited right at this very moment and walk through the onboarding process with us. But as we reviewed under client access, you can invite them at a later point. So if we wanted to start to do a little bit of data entry in the onboarding process before inviting them and engaging them directly in RightCapital, that is certainly possible and is something that you can do later on once you're ready, even if they're still in the onboarding steps, which is what we're going to do. So we're going to click input client's information now. And now we're going to see that exact layout that we had selected. So before, when we first open up the original client that we were working on, the Schmidt family, they had the profile cards layout and they were using what we have as the RC default for those 6 steps of data entry. Since we did just establish in the client group selection and for the default templates for new clients that we wanted to use our onboarding workflow number 1 template, we're now seeing the highlighted steps that are going to be holding our hand through the process that we had indicated and the customized process that we had created with our template. So we're still going to be able to walk through that step 1 of who the family is. So let's say, for example, we're going to be entering the co-client's name. We can still walk through those steps of data entry, looking at their income, savings, and expenses. We're going to see all those cards that are still pre-populated there for us to start to enter and carve out data into. And you can still add new income, savings, and expenses as you're looking to customize the current path for the client. But now we're going to see that different layout. We're going to still see those default cards available for us that we can click into, make modifications to things like their salary, for example, for each client and co-client. Same thing, we're still going to see the Social Security income cards with the blueprint visual layout that are there for us for reference. Still being able to click into each of these to make modifications to their current savings, their current income, and also any current living expenses for somebody that's not yet retired. And you still have full flexibility when we're walking through the targeted and focusing onboarded process, that you can still click into each of the different steps by just clicking on the headers here. So if we actually need to go back a step, we can do so by clicking on the step number 2, or maybe jumping forward. So this is really just walking us through and guiding us and holding our hand through creating the current plan and addressing a lot of those major questions or major goals in their lifetime. But you'll also find the next and previous buttons down below. As you can see, using my Vault templates, for example, we have that set as the standard for new clients. So we have a couple different folders already available for us to start to add new files here, add new folders. Same thing with risk, we assign that risk questionnaire. So this is what it looks like when we do establish a template as the default for new clients. And once we're ready, once we hit the complete button, that's when we're going to be outside of those onboarding steps and we're going to be brought to the full modules of RightCapital. We still can come back to the profile section and make modifications. Like I said, what we were using was a blueprint formatting, and that's going to be found once again under profile blueprint. And you still can make modifications to that data entry from here. You still can address and add new things, customize that data entry. But if we were using the profile cards, that's when we're going to be seeing the profile 6 steps that are isolated for us, from the goals entry to income, savings, expenses, and family. So you can always come back and make adjustments after the fact, but when it comes to that dedicated onboarding flow, we're only going to be able to modify the specific onboarding flow if the client is still in the initial data entry steps, like the Schmidt family. So when we look for the Sparrow family, for example, they're out of those initial data entry steps, so we're not going to see an onboarding tab here. But when we search for Schmidt, we're going to see an onboarding tab here for us. And this is where we can go to start to further customize and manipulate the onboarding flow for this individual client. So still fully customizable in terms of client experience, your own experience when it comes to onboarding. But especially if you have specific workflows, you can create multiple templates under templates onboarding and start to establish those for your different types of clients. So if we did want to establish a different template, such as the profile cards layout, we're going to title this once again, onboarding workflow number 2, save the name. We're going to keep profile card selected. And in this case, we're going to include Vault. Maybe Vault's going to be the second thing that we talk about in this particular workflow. And maybe we want to cover expenses after income. Once we hit save, we can then go to the 3 dots, client settings, client groups, and maybe that's what we use for prospects. So we can come into the client groups, click on the edit button for our default for new leads or prospects, and then change the onboarding template from here to reflect our customized workflow. Same thing if we wanted to do it for the individual client level, we can go back into the clients list and make modifications from there.